You may imagine the general complexion from that moment of my nights. I repeatedly sat up till I didn't know when. I selected moments when my roommate unmistakably slept, and stealing out took noiseless turns in the passage and even pushed as far as to where I had last met Quint. But I never met him there again. And I may as well say at once that I on no other occasion saw him in the house. I just missed, on the staircase, on the other hand, a different adventure. Looking down it from the top, I once recognized the presence of a woman seated on one of the lower steps with her back presented to me, her body half bowed and her head in an attitude of woe in her hands. I had been there but an instant, however, when she vanished without looking round at me. I knew, none the less, exactly what dreadful face she had to show. And I wondered whether, if instead of being above I had been below, I should have had, for going up, the same nerve I had lately shown Quint. Well, there continued to be plenty of chance for nerve. On the 11th night after my latest encounter with that gentleman, they were all numbered now, I had an alarm that perilously skirted it, and that indeed, from the particular quality of its unexpectedness, proved quite my sharpest shock. It was precisely the first night during this series that, weary with watching, I had felt that I might again, without laxity, lay myself down at my old hour. I slept immediately, and as I afterwards knew, till about 1 o'clock. But when I woke, it was to sit straight up, as completely roused as if a hand had shook me. I had left a light burning, but it was now out, and I felt an instant certainty that Flora had extinguished it. This brought me to my feet, and straight in the darkness to her bed, which I found she had left. A glance at the window enlightened me further, and the striking of a match completed the picture. The child had got up, and had, for some purpose of observation or response, squeezed in behind the blind, and was peering out into the night. That she now saw was proved to me by the fact that she was disturbed neither by my re-illumination nor by the haste I made to get into slippers and into a wrap. Hidden, protected, absorbed, she evidently rested on the sill, the casement opened forward, and gave herself up. There was a great still moon to help her, and this fact had counted in my quick decision. She was face to face with the apparition we had met at the lake, and could now communicate with it, as she had not then been able to do. What I, on my side, had to care for was, without disturbing her, to reach from the corridor some other window in the same quarter. I got to the door without her hearing me. I got out of it, closed it, and listened from the other side for some sound from her. There were empty rooms at Bly, and it was only a question of choosing the right one. The right one suddenly presented itself to me as the lower one, though high above the gardens, in the solid corner of the house known as the Old Tower. This was a large, square chamber, arranged with some state as a bedroom, the extravagant size of which made it so convenient that it had not for years, though kept by Mrs. Gross in exemplary order, been occupied. I'd often admired it, and I knew my way about in it. I had only, after just faltering at the first chill gloom of its disuse, to pass across it and unbolt, as quietly as I could, one of its shutters. Achieving this transit, I uncovered the glass without a sound, and applying my face to the pane, was able, the darkness without being much less than within, to see that I commanded the right direction. Then I saw something more. The moon made the night extraordinarily penetrable, and showed me on the lawn a person, diminished by distance, who stood there motionless, and as if fascinated, looking up to where I had appeared, looking, that is, not so much straight at me, as at something that was apparently above me. There was clearly another person above me. There was a person on the tower. But the presence on the lawn was not in the least what I had conceived, and had confidently hurried to meet. The presence on the lawn, I felt sick as I made it out, was poor little Miles himself. It was not till late next day that I spoke to Mrs. Gross. She had joined me, under pressure, on the terrace, where, with the lapse of the season, the afternoon sun was now agreeable, and we sat there together, while before us, at a distance, but within call if we wished, the children strolled to and fro in one of their most manageable moods. They moved slowly, in unison, below us, over the lawn, the boy, as they went, reading aloud from a storybook and passing his arm round his sister to keep her quite in touch. Mrs. Grose watched them with positive placidity. Then I caught the suppressed intellectual creak with which he conscientiously turned to take from me a view of the back of the tapestry. I had made her a receptacle of lurid things, but there was an odd recognition of my superiority, my accomplishments and my function, in her patience under my pain. She offered her mind to my disclosures as, had I wished to mix a witch's broth and proposed it with assurance, she would have held out a large, clean saucepan. This had become thoroughly her attitude by the time that, in my recital of the events of the night, I reached the point of what Miles had said to me, when, after seeing him at such a monstrous hour, almost on the very spot where he happened now to be, I had gone down to bring him in, choosing then, at the window, with a concentrated need of not alarming the house, rather that method than a signal more resonant. I had left her meanwhile in little doubt of my small hope of representing with success, even to her actual sympathy, my sense of the real splendour of the little inspiration with which, after I had got him into the house, the boy met my final articulate challenge. As soon as I appeared in the moonlight on the terrace, he had come to me as straight as possible, on which I had taken his hand without a word and led him through the dark spaces, up the staircase where Quint had so hungrily hovered for him, along the lobby where I had listened and trembled, and so to his forsaken room. I was, of course, thoroughly kind and merciful. Never, never yet had I placed on his little shoulders hands of such tenderness as those with which, while I rested against the bed, I held him there, well under fire. I had no alternative, but in form, at least, to put it to him. "You must tell me now, and all the truth. What did you go out for? What were you doing there?" I can still see his wonderful smile, the whites of his beautiful eyes and the uncovering of his little teeth shine to me in the dusk. "If I tell you why, will you understand?" My heart at this leapt into my mouth. Would he tell me why? I found no sound on my lips to press it, and I was aware of replying only with a vague, repeated, grimacing nod. He was gentleness itself, and while I wagged my head at him, he stood there more than ever a little fairy prince. It was his brightness, indeed, that gave me a respite. Would it be so great if he were really going to tell me? "Well," he said at last, "just exactly in order that you should do this." "Do what?" "Think me, for a change, bad." I shall never forget the sweetness and gaiety with which he brought out the word, nor how, on top of it, he bent forward and kissed me. It was practically the end of everything. I met his kiss, and I had to make, while I folded him for a minute in my arms, the most stupendous effort not to cry. He had given exactly the account of himself that permitted least of my going behind it, and it was only with the effect of confirming my acceptance of it that, as I presently glanced about the room, I could say, "Then you didn't undress at all?" He fairly glittered in the gloom. "Not at all. I sat up and read." "And when did you go down?" "At midnight. When I'm bad, I am bad." I see, it's charming. But how could you be sure I would know it?" "Oh, I arranged that with Flora." His answers rang out with a readiness. "She was to get up and look out." "Which is what she did do." It was I who fell into the trap. "So she disturbed you, and to see what she was looking at, you also looked. You saw." "Why, you," I concurred, "caught your death in the night air." He literally bloomed so from this exploit that he could afford radiantly to assent. "How otherwise should I have been bad enough?" he asked. Then, after another embrace, the incident and our interview closed on my recognition of all the reserves of goodness that for his joke he had been able to draw upon. The particular impression I had received proved in the morning light not quite successfully presentable to Mrs. Grose, though I reinforced it with the mention of still another remark that he had made before we separated. "It all lies in 6 words," I said to her, "words that really settle the matter. Think, you know, what I might do." He threw that off to show me how good he is. He knows down to the ground what he might do. That's what he gave them a taste of at school. "Lord, you do change," cried my friend. "I don't change, I simply make it out. The 4, depend upon it, perpetually meet. If on either of these last nights you had been with either child, you would clearly have understood. The more I've watched and waited, the more I felt that if there were nothing else to make it sure, it would be made so by the systematic silence of each. Never by a slip of the tongue have they so much as alluded to either of their old friends, any more than Miles has alluded to his expulsion. Oh, yes, we may sit here and look at them, and they may show off to us there to their fill. But even while they pretend to be lost in their fairy tale, they're steeped in their vision of the dead restored. He's not reading to her," I declared. "They're talking of them. They're talking horrors. I go on, I know, as if I were crazy, and it's a wonder I'm not. What I've seen would have made you so. But it has only made me more lucid, made me get hold of still other things. My lucidity must have seemed awful, but the charming creatures who were victims of it, passing and repassing in their interlocked sweetness, gave my colleague something to hold on by, and I felt how tight she held as, without stirring in the breath of my passion, she covered them still with her eyes. "Of what other things have you got hold?" "Why, of the very things that have delighted, fascinated, and yet at bottom, as I now so strangely see, mystified and troubled me. They're more than earthly beauty. They're absolutely unnatural goodness. It's a game," I went on. "It's a policy and a fraud. On the part of little darlings? As yet mere lovely babies? Yes, mad as that seems." The very act of bringing it out really helped me to trace it, follow it all up, and piece it all together. They haven't been good. They've only been absent. It has been easy to live with them because they're simply leading a life of their own. They're not mine. They're not ours. They're his and they're hers. Quince and that woman's. Quince and that woman's. They want to get to them." Oh, how at this poor Mrs. Grose appeared to study them. But for what?" "For the love of all the evil that in those dreadful days the pair put into them, and to ply them with that evil still. To keep up the work of demons is what brings the others back." "Laws!" said my friend under her breath. The exclamation was homely, but it revealed a real acceptance of my further proof of what, in the bad time, for there had been worse even than this, must have occurred. There could have been no such justification for me as the plain assent of her experience to whatever depth of depravity I found credible in our brace of scoundrels. It was in obvious submission of memory that she brought out after a moment, "They were rascals." "But what can they now do?" she pursued. "Do?" I echoed so loud that Miles and Flora, as they passed at their distance, paused an instant in their walk and looked at us. "Don't they do enough?" I demanded in a lower tone, while the children, having smiled and nodded and kissed hands to us, resumed their exhibition. We were held by it a minute. Then I answered, "They can destroy them." At this my companion did turn, but the inquiry she launched was a silent one, the effect of which was to make me more explicit. "They don't know as yet quite how, but they're trying hard. They're seen only across, as it were, and beyond, in strange places and on high places, the top of towers, the roof of houses, the outside of windows, the further edge of pools. But there's a deep design on either side to shorten the distance and overcome the obstacle, and the success of the tempters is only a question of time. They've only to keep to their suggestions of danger, for the children to come and perish in the attempt. Mrs. Gross slowly got up, and I scrupulously added, unless, of course, we can prevent. Standing there before me while I kept my seat, she visibly turned things over. Their uncle must do the preventing. He must take them away. And who's to make him? She had been scanning the distance, but she now dropped on me a foolish face. You, miss. Ha! By writing to him that his house is poisoned and his little nephew and niece mad? But if they are, miss, and if I am myself, you mean, that's charming news to be sent him by a governess whose prime undertaking was to give him no worry. Mrs. Gross considered, following the children again. Yes, he do hate worry. That was the great reason why those fiends took him in so long. No doubt, though his indifference must have been awful. As I am not a fiend, at any rate, I shouldn't take him in. My companion, after an instant, and for all answer, sat down again and grasped my arm. Make him at any rate come to you. But what am I to tell him? You needn't tell him anything. I'll tell him. I measured this. Do you mean you'll write? Remembering she couldn't, I caught myself up. How do you communicate? I'll tell the bailiff. He writes. And should you like him to write our story? My question had a sarcastic force that I had not fully intended, and it made her, after a moment, inconsequently break down. Tears were in her eyes. Oh, miss, you write. Well, tonight, I at last answered, and on this we separated. The next day, after lessons, Mrs. Gross found a moment to say to me quietly, Have you written, miss? Yes, I've written. But I didn't add, for the hour, that my letter, sealed and directed, was still in my pocket. There would be time enough to send it before the messenger should go to the village. Meanwhile, there had been on the part of my pupils no more brilliant, more exemplary morning. It was exactly as if they had both had at heart to gloss over any recent friction. They performed the dizziest feats of arithmetic, soaring quite out of my feeble range, and perpetrated in higher spirits than ever geographical and historical jokes. It was conspicuous, of course, in Miles in particular, that he appeared to wish to show how easily he could let me down. This child, to my memory, really lives in a setting of beauty and misery that no words can translate. There was a distinction all his own in every impulse he revealed. Never was a small natural creature to the uninitiated eye, all frankness and freedom, a more ingenious, a more extraordinary little gentleman. I had perpetually to guard against the wonder of contemplation into which my initiated view betrayed me, to check the irrelevant gaze and discouraged sigh in which I constantly both attacked and renounced the enigma of what such a little gentleman could have done that deserved a penalty. Say that, by the dark prodigy I knew, the imagination of all evil had been opened up to him. All the justice within me ached for the proof that it could ever have flowered into an act. He had never, at any rate, been such a little gentleman as when, after our early dinner on this dreadful day, he came round to me and asked if I shouldn't like him for half an hour to play to me. He sat down at the old piano and played as he had never played. And if there are those who think he had better have been kicking a football, I can only say that I wholly agree with them. For at the end of a time that, under his influence, I had quite ceased to measure, I started up with a strange sense of having literally slept at my post. It was after luncheon, and by the schoolroom fire, and yet I hadn't really in the least slept. I had only done something much worse. I had forgotten. Where, all this time, was Flora? When I put the question to Miles, he played on a minute before answering, and then could only say, "Why, my dear, how do I know?" breaking, moreover, into a happy laugh, which immediately after, as if it were a vocal accompaniment, he prolonged into incoherent, extravagant song. I went straight to my room, but his sister was not there. Then, before going downstairs, I looked into several others. As she was nowhere about, she would surely be with Mrs. Gross, whom, in the comfort of that theory, I accordingly proceeded in quest of. I found her, but she met my quick challenge with blank, scared ignorance. She had only supposed that after the repast I had carried off both the children, as to which she was quite in her right, for it was the very first time I had allowed the little girl out of my sight without some special provision. Of course, now indeed she might be with the maids, so that the immediate thing was to look for her without an air of alarm. This we promptly arranged between us. But when, 10 minutes later, and in pursuance of our arrangement, we met in the hall, it was only to report on either side that after guarded inquiries we had altogether failed to trace her. For a minute there, apart from observation, we exchanged mute alarms, and I could feel with what high interest my friend returned me all those I had from the first given her. "She'll be above," she presently said, "in one of the rooms you haven't searched." "No, she's at a distance." I had made up my mind. "She has gone out." Mrs. Gross stared. "Without a hat?" I naturally also looked volumes. "Isn't that woman always without one?" "She's with her?" "She's with her," I declared. "We must find them." My hand was on my friend's arm, but she failed for the moment, confronted with such an account of the matter, to respond to my pressure. She communed, on the contrary, on the spot, with her uneasiness. "And where's Master Miles?" "Oh, he's with Quint. They're in the schoolroom." "Lord, miss!" My view, I was myself aware, and therefore I suppose my tone, had never yet reached so calm an assurance. "The trick's played," I went on. "They've successfully worked their plan. He found the most divine little way to keep me quiet while she went off." "Divine?" Mrs. Gross bewilderedly echoed. "Infernal, then," I almost cheerfully rejoined. "He has provided for himself as well. But come." She had helplessly gloomed at the upper regions. "You leave him so long with Quint?" "Yes, I don't mind that now." She always ended at these moments by getting possession of my hand, and in this manner she could at present still stay me. But after gasping an instant at my sudden resignation, "Because of your letter?" she eagerly brought out. I quickly, by way of answer, felt for my letter, drew it forth, held it up, and then, freeing myself, went and laid it on the great hall table. "Luke will take it," I said as I came back. I reached the house door and opened it. I was already on the steps. My companion still demurred. The storm of the night and the early morning had dropped, but the afternoon was damp and grey. I came down to the drive while she stood in the doorway. "You go with nothing on?" "Ha! What do I care when the child has nothing? I can't wait to dress," I cried, "and if you must do so, I leave you. Try meanwhile yourself upstairs." "Oh, with them?" Oh, on this the poor woman promptly joined me. We went straight to the lake. The usual place of embarkation was 1/2 mile from the house, but I had an intimate conviction that wherever Flora might be, she was not near home. She had not given me the slip for any small adventure, and since the day of the very great one that I had shared with her by the pond, I had been aware, in our walks, of the quarter to which she most inclined. This was why I had now given to Mrs. Gross's steps so marked a direction that made her, when she perceived it, oppose a resistance that showed me she was freshly mystified. "You're going to the water, miss? You think she's in?" "She may be, though the depth is, I believe, nowhere very great. But what I judge most likely is that she's on the spot from which the other day we saw together when I told you." "When she pretended not to see, with that astounding self-possession." I've always been sure she wanted to go back alone, and now her brother has managed it for her. Mrs. Grose still stood where she had stopped. You suppose they really talk of them? I could meet this with a confidence. They say things that if we heard them would simply appall us. And if she is there, yes, then Miss Jessel is? Beyond a doubt, you shall see. Oh, thank you, my friend cried, planted so firm that taking it in I went straight on without her. By the time I reached the pool, however, she was close behind me, and I knew that whatever to her apprehension might befall me, the exposure of my society struck her as her least danger. She exhaled a moan of relief as we at last came in sight of the greater part of the water without a sight of the child. There was no trace of Flora on that nearer side of the bank, where my observation of her had been most startling, and none on the opposite edge, where, save for a margin of some 20 yards, a thick copse came down to the water. The pond, oblong in shape, had a width so scant compared to its length that with its ends out of view it might have been taken for a scant river. We looked at the empty expanse, and then I felt the suggestion of my friend's eyes. I knew what she meant, and I replied with a negative headshake, "No, no, wait. She has taken the boat." My companion stared at the vacant mooring place, and then again across the lake. "Then where is it?" "Our not seeing it is the strongest of proofs. She has used it to go over, and then has managed to hide it." "All alone, that child?" "She's not alone, and at such time she's not a child. She's an old, old woman." I scanned all the visible shore, while Mrs. Grose took again into the queer element I offered one of her plunges of submission. Then I pointed out that the boat might perfectly be in a small refuge formed by one of the recesses of the pool, an indentation masked for the hither side by a projection of the bank and by a clump of trees growing close to the water. "But if the boat's there, where on earth's she?" my colleague anxiously asked. "That's exactly what we must learn," and I started to walk further. "Are going all the way round?" "Certainly, far as it is. It'll take us but 10 minutes, but it's far enough to have made the child prefer not to walk. She went straight over." "Laws!" cried my friend again. The chain of my logic was ever too much for her. It dragged her at my heels even now, and when we had got half-way round, a devious, tiresome process, on ground much broken, and by a path choked with overgrowth, I paused to give her breath. I sustained her with a grateful arm, assuring her that she might hugely help me, and this started us afresh, so that in the course of but few minutes more we reached a point from which we found the boat to be where I had supposed it. There was a gate in the fence, through which we passed, and that brought us, after a trifling interval, more into the open. Then, "There she is!" we both exclaimed at once. Flora, a short way off, stood before us on the grass, and smiled, as if her performance was now complete. The next thing she did, however, was to stoop straight down and pluck, quite as if it were all she was there for, a big, ugly spray of withered fern. I instantly became sure she had just come out of the copse. She waited for us, not herself taking a step, and I was conscious of the rare solemnity with which we presently approached her. She smiled, and we met. But it was all done in a silence by this time flagrantly ominous. It was Flora who, gazing all over me in candid wonder, was the first to break it. She was struck with our bare-headed aspect. "Why, where are your things?" "Where yours are, my dear," I promptly returned. She had already got back her gaiety, and appeared to take this as an answer quite sufficient. "And where's Miles?" she went on. There was something in the small valour of it that quite finished me. These 3 words from her were in a flash like the glitter of a drawn blade, the jostle of the cup that my hand for weeks and weeks had held high and full to the brim, and that now, even before speaking, I felt overflow in a deluge. "I'll tell you if you'll tell me," I heard myself say. Then I heard the tremor in which it broke. "Well, what?" Mrs. Groce's suspense blazed at me, but it was too late now, and I brought the thing out handsomely. "Where, my pet, is Miss Jessel?" The whole thing was upon us. Much as I had made of the fact that this name had never once between us been sounded, the quick, smitten glare with which the child's face now received it fairly likened my breach of the silence to the smash of a pane of glass. It added to the interposing cry, as if to stay the blow, that Mrs. Groce at the same instant uttered over my violence, the shriek of a creature scared or rather wounded, which in turn, within a few seconds, was completed by a gasp of my own. I seized my colleague's arm. "She's there! She's there!" Miss Jessel stood before us on the opposite bank, exactly as she had stood the other time. And I remember, strangely as the first feeling now produced in me, my thrill of joy at having brought on a proof. She was there, and I was justified. She was there, and I was neither cruel nor mad. She was there for poor scared Mrs. Groce, but she was there most for Flora. And no moment of my monstrous time was perhaps so extraordinary as that in which I consciously threw out to her, with the sense that, pale and ravenous demon as she was, she would catch and understand it, an inarticulate message of gratitude. She rose erect on the spot my friend and I had lately quitted, and there was not in all the long reach of her desire an inch of her evil that fell short. The first vividness of vision and emotion were things of a few seconds, during which Mrs. Groce's dazed blink across to where I pointed struck me as a sovereign sign that she too at last saw, just as it carried my own eyes precipitately to the child. The revelation then of the manner in which Flora was affected startled me in truth far more than it would have done to find her also merely agitated, for direct dismay was of course not what I had expected. Prepared and on our guard as our pursuit had actually made her, she would repress every betrayal, and I was therefore shaken on the spot by my first glimpse of the particular one for which I had not allowed. To see her, without a convulsion of her small pink face, not even feign to glance in the direction of the prodigy I announced, but only, instead of that, turn at me an expression of hard, still gravity, an expression absolutely new and unprecedented, and that appeared to read and accuse and judge me. This was a stroke that somehow converted the little girl herself into the very presence that could make me quail. I quailed, even though my certitude that she thoroughly saw was never greater than at that instant. And in the immediate need to defend myself, I called it passionately to witness. "She's there, you little unhappy thing, there, 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 and you see her as well as you see me." I had said shortly before to Mrs. Groce that she was not at these times a child, but an old, old woman, and that description of her could not have been more strikingly confirmed than in the way in which, for all answer to this, she simply showed me without a concession an admission of her eyes, a countenance of deeper and deeper, of indeed suddenly quite fixed reprobation. I was, by this time, if I can put the whole thing at all together, more appalled at what I may properly call her manner than at anything else, though it was simultaneously with this that I became aware of having Mrs. Groce also, and very formidably, to reckon with. My elder companion, the next moment at any rate, blotted out everything but her own flushed face and her loud, shocked protest, a burst of high disapproval. "What a dreadful turn, to be sure, miss! Where on earth do you see anything?" I could only grasp her more quickly yet, for even while she spoke, the hideous, plain presence stood undimmed and undaunted. It had already lasted a minute, and it lasted while I continued, seizing my colleague, quite thrusting her at it and presenting her to it, to insist with my pointing hand. "You don't see her exactly as we see? You mean to say you don't now? Now? Oh, she's as big as a blazing fire. Only look, dearest woman, look!" She looked, even as I did, and gave me, with her deep groan of negation, repulsion, compassion, the mixture with her pity of her relief at her exemption, a sense, touching to me even then, that she would have backed me up if she could. I might well have needed that, for with this hard blow of the proof that her eyes were hopelessly sealed, I felt my own situation horribly crumble. I saw my livid predecessor press from her position on my defeat, and I was conscious more than all of what I should have from this instant to deal with in the astounding little attitude of Flora. Into this attitude Mrs. Grose immediately and violently entered, breaking, even while there pierced through my sense of ruin a prodigious private triumph, into breathless reassurance. "She isn't there, little lady, and nobody's there, and you never see nothing, my sweet. How can poor Miss Jessel, when poor Miss Jessel's dead and buried? We know, don't we, love?" And she appealed, blundering in to the child. "It's all a mere mistake and a worry and a joke, and we'll go home as fast as we can." Our companion on this had responded with a strange, quick primness of propriety, and they were again, with Mrs. Grose on her feet, united, as it were, in pained opposition to me. Flora continued to fix me with her small mask of reprobation, and even at that minute I prayed God to forgive me for seeming to see that, as she stood there, holding tight to our friend's dress, her incomparable childish beauty had suddenly failed, had quite vanished. I've said it already. She was hideously hard. She had turned common and almost ugly.
"I don't know what you mean. I see nobody. I see nothing. I never have. I think you're cruel. I don't like you."
Then, after this deliverance, which might have been that of a vulgarly pert little girl in the street, she hugged Mrs. Grose more closely and buried in her skirts the dreadful little face. In this position she produced an almost furious wail.
"Take me away! Take me away! Oh, take me away from her!"
"From me?" I panted.
"From you! From you!"
she cried. Even Mrs. Grose looked across at me dismayed, while I had nothing to do but communicate again with the figure that on the opposite bank, without a movement, as rigidly still as if catching beyond the interval our voices, was as vividly there for my disaster as it was not there for my service. The wretched child had spoken exactly as if she had got from some outside source each of her stabbing little words, and I could therefore, in the full despair of all I had to accept, but sadly shake my head at her. If I had ever doubted, all my doubt would at present have gone. I've been living with the miserable truth, and now it has only too much closed round me. Of course I've lost you. I've interfered, and you've seen, under her dictation, with which I faced over the pool again our infernal witness, the easy and perfect way to meet it. I've done my best, but I've lost you. Goodbye." For Mrs. Grose I had an imperative and almost frantic, "Go, go!" before which, in infinite distress, but mutely possessed of the little girl, and clearly convinced, in spite of her blindness, that something awful had occurred, and some collapse engulfed us, she retreated by the way we had come, as fast as she could move. Of what first happened when I was left alone, I had no subsequent memory. I only knew that at the end of, I suppose, a quarter of an hour, an odorous dampness and roughness, chilling and piercing my trouble, had made me understand that I must have thrown myself on my face on the ground and given way to a wildness of grief. I must have lain there long and cried and sobbed, for when I raised my head, the day was almost done. I got up and looked a moment through the twilight at the grey pool and its blank, haunted edge, and then I took back to the house my dreary and difficult course. When I reached the gate in the fence, the boat, to my surprise, was gone, so that I had a fresh reflection to make on Flora's extraordinary command of the situation. She passed that night by the most tacit, and I should add, were not the word so grotesque, a false note, the happiest of arrangements, with Mrs. Gross. I saw neither of them on my return, but on the other hand, as by an ambiguous compensation, I saw a great deal of Miles. I saw, I can use no other phrase, so much of him that it was as if it were more than it had ever been. No evening I had passed at Bly had the portentous quality of this one. In spite of which, and in spite also of the deeper depths of consternation that had opened beneath my feet, there was literally, in the ebbing actual, an extraordinarily sweet sadness. On reaching the house, I had never so much as looked for the boy. I had simply gone straight to my room to change what I was wearing and to take in at a glance much material testimony to Flora's rupture. Her little belongings had all been removed. When later, by the schoolroom fire, I was served with tea by the usual maid, I indulged on the article of my other pupil in no inquiry whatever. He had his freedom now. He might have it to the end. Well, he did have it, and it consisted, in part at least, of his coming in at about 8 o'clock and sitting down with me in silence. On the removal of the tea things, I had blown out the candles and drawn my chair closer. I was conscious of mortal coldness, and felt as if I should never again be warm. So when he appeared, I was sitting in the glow with my thoughts. He paused a moment by the door, as if to look at me, then, as if to share them, came to the other side of the hearth and sank into a chair. We sat there in absolute stillness, yet he wanted, I felt, to be with me. Before a new day in my room had fully broken, my eyes opened to Mrs. Gross, who had come to my bedside with worse news. Flora was so markedly feverish that an illness was perhaps at hand. She had passed a night of extreme unrest, a night agitated above all by fears that had for their subject not in the least her former, but wholly her present governess. It was not against the possible re-entrance of Miss Jessel on the scene that she protested. It was conspicuously and passionately against mine. What Flora wants, of course, I said, is to get rid of me. My companion bravely concurred. Never again to so much as look at you. So that what you've come to me now for, I asked, is to speed me on my way? Before she had time to reply, however, I had her in check. I've a better idea. The result of my reflections. My going would seem the right thing, and yesterday I was terribly near it, yet that won't do. It's you who must go. You must take Flora. My visitor at this did speculate. But where in the world? Away from here, away from them, away, even most of all now, from me, straight to her uncle. Only to tell on you? No, not only. To leave me in addition with my remedy. She was still vague. And what is your remedy? Your loyalty, to begin with. And then Miles's. She looked at me hard. Do you think he won't, if he has the chance, turn on me? Yes, I venture still to think it. At all events, I want to try. Get off with his sister as soon as possible and leave me with him alone. Are you so sure of the little gentleman? I'm not sure of anything but you. But I have, since last evening, a new hope. I think he wants to give me an opening. I do believe that poor little exquisite wretch, he wants to speak. Last evening in the firelight and the silence, he sat with me for 2 hours, as if it were just coming. Mrs. Gross looked hard through the window at the grey gathering day. And did it come? No. Though I waited and waited, I confess it didn't. And it was without a breach of the silence or so much as a faint allusion to his sister's condition and absence that we at last kissed for good night. All the same, I continued, I can't, if her uncle sees her, consent to his seeing her brother without my having given the boy, and most of all because things have got so bad, a little more time. My friend appeared on this ground more reluctant than I could quite understand. What do you mean by more time? Well, a day or two, really to bring it out. He'll then be on my side, of which you see the importance. If nothing comes, I shall only fail, and you will at the worst have helped me by doing on your arrival in town whatever you may have found possible. So I put it before her, but she continued for a little so inscrutably embarrassed that I came again to her aid. Unless, indeed, I wound up, you really want not to go. I could see it in her face at last clear itself. She put out her hand to me as a pledge. I'll go. I'll go. I'll go this morning. I wanted to be very just. If you should wish still to wait, I would engage she shouldn't see me. No, it's the place itself. She must leave it. She held me a moment with heavy eyes, then brought out the rest. Your idea's the right one. I myself, well, I can't stay. The look she gave me with it made me jump at possibilities. You mean that since yesterday you have seen? She shook her head with dignity. I've heard. Heard? From that child. Horrors. There. She sighed with tragic relief. Oh, on my honour, miss, she says things... But at this evocation she broke down. She dropped with a sudden sob upon my sofa, and as I had seen her do before, gave way to all the grief of it. It was quite in another manner that I, for my part, let myself go. Oh, thank God! She sprang up again at this, drying her eyes with a groan. Thank God! It so justifies me. It does that, miss. I couldn't have desired more emphasis, but I just hesitated. She's so horrible? I saw my colleague scarce knew how to put it. Really shocking. And about me? About you, miss, since you must have it. Oh, it's beyond everything for a young lady, and I can't think wherever she must have picked up the appalling language she applied to me. Ha! I can, then. I broke in with a laugh that was doubtless significant enough. It only, in truth, left my friend still more grave. Well, perhaps I ought to also, since I've heard some of it before. Yet I can't bear it. The poor woman went on, while with the same movement she glanced on my dressing-table at the face of my watch. But I must go back. I kept her, however. Ah, if you can't bear it, how can I stop with her, you mean? Why, just for that, to get her away, far from this, she pursued, far from them. She may be different, she may be free. I seized her almost with joy. Then in spite of yesterday you believe in such doings? Her simple description of them required, in the light of her expression, to be carried no further, and she gave me the whole thing as she had never done. I believe. Yes, it was a joy, and we were still shoulder to shoulder. If I might continue sure of that, I should care but little what else happened. There's one thing, of course, it occurs to me to remember. My letter giving the alarm will have reached town before you. I now perceived still more how she had been beating about the bush, and how weary at last it had made her. Your letter won't have got there. Your letter never went. What then became of it? Goodness knows. Master Miles. Do you mean he took it? I gasped. She hung fire, but she overcame her reluctance. I mean that I saw yesterday, when I came back with Miss Flora, that it wasn't where you had put it. Later in the evening I had the chance to question Luke, and he declared that he had neither noticed nor touched it. We could only exchange on this one of our deeper mutual soundings, and it was Mrs. Grose who first brought up the plum with an almost elate, "You see!" Yes. I see that if Miles took it instead, he probably will have read it and destroyed it. And don't you see anything else? I faced her a moment with a sad smile. It strikes me that by this time your eyes are open even wider than mine. They proved to be so indeed, but she could still blush almost to show it. I make out now what he must have done at school. And she gave, in her simple sharpness, an almost droll, disillusioned nod. He stole. I turned it over. I tried to be more judicial. "Well, perhaps." She looked as if she found me unexpectedly calm. "He stole letters." She couldn't know my reasons for a calmness, after all, pretty shallow, so I showed them off as I might. "I hope, then, it was to more purpose than in this case. The note, at any rate, that I put on the table yesterday," I pursued, "will have given him so scant an advantage, for it contained only the bare demand for an interview, that he is already much ashamed of having gone so far for so little, and that what he had on his mind last evening was precisely the need of confession. I seemed to myself for an instant to have mastered it, to see it all. Leave us, leave us." I was already at the door, hurrying her off. "I'll get it out of him. He'll meet me. He'll confess. If he confesses, he's saved. And if he's saved, then you are?" The dear woman kissed me on this, and I took her farewell. "I'll save you without him," she cried as she went. Yet it was when she had got off, and I missed her on the spot, that the great pinch really came. If I had counted on what it would give me to find myself alone with Miles, I speedily perceived, at least, that it would give me a measure. No hour of my stay, in fact, was so assailed with apprehensions as that of my coming down to learn that the carriage containing Mrs. Gross and my younger pupil had already rolled out of the gates. Now I said to myself, face to face with the elements, and for much of the rest of the day, while I fought my weakness, I could consider that I had been supremely rash. It was a tighter place still than I had yet turned round in, all the more that for the first time I could see in the aspect of others a confused reflection of the crisis. What had happened naturally caused them all to stare. There was too little of the explained, throw out whatever we might, in the suddenness of my colleague's act. The maids and the men looked blank, the effect of which on my nerves was an aggravation, until I saw the necessity of making it a positive aid. It was precisely, in short, by just clutching the helm that I avoided total wreck, and I dare say that to bear up at all, I became that morning very grand and very dry. I welcomed the consciousness that I was charged with much to do, and I caused it to be known as well that, left thus to myself, I was quite remarkably firm. I paraded with a sick heart. To mark for the house the high state I cultivated, I decreed that my meals with the boy should be served, as we called it, downstairs, so that I had been awaiting him in the ponderous pomp of the room outside of the window of which I had had from Mrs. Gross, that first scared Sunday, my flash of something it would scarce have done to call light. Here at present I felt afresh, for I had felt it again and again, how my equilibrium depended on the success of my rigid will, the will to shut my eyes as tight as possible to the truth that what I had to deal with was, revoltingly, against nature. I could only get on at all by taking nature into my confidence and my account, by treating my monstrous ordeal as a push in a direction unusual, of course, and unpleasant, but demanding, after all, for a fair front, only another turn of the screw of ordinary human virtue. No attempt, none the less, could well require more tact than just this attempt to supply oneself all the nature. How could I put even a little of that article into a suppression of reference to what had occurred? How, on the other hand, could I make a reference without a new plunge into the hideous obscure? It was as if, when we were face to face in the dining-room, he had literally shown me the way. The roast mutton was on the table, and I had dispensed with attendance. Miles, before he sat down, stood a moment with his hands in his pockets and looked at the joint, on which he seemed on the point of passing some humorous judgment. But what he presently produced was, "I say, my dear, is she really very awfully ill?" "Little Flora? Not so bad but that she'll presently be better. London will set her up. Bligh had ceased to agree with her. Come here and take your mutton. He alertly obeyed me, carried the plate carefully to his seat, and when he was established went on, "Did Bligh disagree with her so terribly suddenly?" "Not so suddenly as you might think. One had seen it coming on." "Then why didn't you get her off before?" "Before what?" "Before she became too ill to travel." I found myself prompt. "She's not too ill to travel. She only might have become so if she had stayed." This was just the moment to seize. "The journey will dissipate the influence," oh, I was grand, "and carry it off." "I see, I see." Miles, for that matter, was grand too. He settled to his repast with the charming little table manner that from the day of his arrival had relieved me of all grossness of admonition. Whatever he had been driven from school for, it was not for ugly feeding. He was irreproachable, as always, today. But he was unmistakably more conscious. He was discernibly trying to take for granted more things than he found without assistance quite easy, and he dropped into peaceful silence while he felt his situation. Our meal was of the briefest, mine a vain pretence, and I had the things immediately removed. While this was done, Miles stood again with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me, stood and looked out of the wide window through which, that other day, I had seen what pulled me up. We continued silent while the maid was with us, as silent, it whimsically occurred to me, as some young couple who, on their wedding journey at the inn, feel shy in the presence of the waiter. He turned round only when the waiter had left us. "Well, so we're alone." "Oh, more or less." I fancy my smile was pale. "Not absolutely. We shouldn't like that," I went on. "No, I suppose we shouldn't. Of course, we have the others." "We have the others. We have indeed the others," I concurred. "Yet, even though we have them," he returned, still with his hands in his pockets and planted there in front of me, "they don't much count, do they?" I made the best of it, but I felt wan. "It depends on what you call much." "Yes," with all accommodation. "Everything depends." On this, however, he faced to the window again, and presently reached it with his vague, restless, cogitating step. He remained there a while, with his forehead against the glass, in contemplation of the stupid shrubs I knew and the dull things of November. I had always my hypocrisy of work, behind which now I gained the sofa. Steadying myself with it there, as I had repeatedly done at those moments of torment that I have described as the moments of my knowing the children to be given to something from which I was barred, I sufficiently obeyed my habit of being prepared for the worst. But an extraordinary impression dropped on me as I extracted a meaning from the boy's embarrassed back, none other than the impression that I was not barred now. This inference grew in a few minutes to sharp intensity, and seemed bound up with the direct perception that it was positively he who was. The frames and squares of the great window were a kind of image for him of a kind of failure. I felt that I saw him at any rate shut in or shut out. He was admirable, but not comfortable. I took it in with a throb of hope. Wasn't he looking through the haunted pane for something he couldn't see, and wasn't it the first time in the whole business that he had known such a lapse? The first, the very first? I found it a splendid portent. It made him anxious, though he watched himself. He'd been anxious all day, and even while in his usual sweet little manner he sat at table, had needed all his small, strange genius to give it a gloss. "Tell me," I said, oh, my work preoccupied me, and I was off-hand, "if yesterday afternoon, from the table in the hall, you took, you know, my letter?" My sense of how he received this suffered for a minute from something that I can describe only as a fierce split of my attention, a stroke that at first, as I sprang straight up, reduced me to the mere blind movement of getting hold of him, drawing him close, and while I just fell for support against the nearest piece of furniture, instinctively keeping him with his back to the window. The appearance was full upon us that I had already had to deal with here. Peter Quint had come into view like a sentinel before a prison. The next thing I saw was that from outside he had reached the window, and then I knew that close to the glass and glaring in through it, he offered once more to the room his white face of damnation. It represents but grossly what took place within me at the sight, to say that on the second my decision was made. Yet I believe that no woman so overwhelmed ever, in so short a time, recovered her grasp of the act. It came to me in the very horror of the immediate presence that the act would be seeing and facing what I saw and faced, to keep the boy himself unaware. The inspiration, I can call it by no other name, was that I felt how voluntarily, how transcendently I might. It was like fighting with a demon for a human soul. And when I had fairly so appraised it, I saw how the human soul, held out in the tremor of my hands at arm's length, had a perfect dew of sweat on a lovely, childish forehead. The face that was close to mine was as white as the face against the glass, and out of it presently came a sound, not low nor weak, but as if from much farther away, that I drank like a waft of fragrance. Yes, I took it. At this, with a moan of joy, I drew him close, and while I held him to my breast, where I could feel in the sudden fever of his little body the tremendous pulse of his little heart, I kept my eyes on the thing at the window, and saw it move and shift its posture. I have likened it to a sentinel, but its slow wheel for a moment was rather the prowl of a baffled beast. My present quickened courage, however, was such that not too much to let it through, I had to shade, as it were, my flame. Meanwhile, the glare of the face was again at the window, the scoundrel fixed as if to watch and wait. It was the very confidence that I might now defy him, as well as the positive certitude by this time of the child's unconsciousness, that made me go on. "What did you take it for?"
"To see what you said about me."
"You opened the letter?"
"I opened it."
My eyes were now, as I held him off a little again, on Miles's own face, in which the collapse of mockery showed me how complete was the ravage of uneasiness. What was prodigious was that at last, by my success, his sense was sealed, and his communication stopped. He knew that he was in presence, but knew not of what, and knew still less that I also was, and that I did know. And what did this strain of trouble matter, when my eyes went back to the window only to see that the air was clear again, and by my personal triumph the influence quenched? There was nothing there. I felt that the cause was mine, and that I should surely get all. I kissed his forehead. It was drenched. "So, what have you done with it?"
"I've burnt it."
"Burnt it?" It was now or never. "Is that what you did at school?" Oh, what this brought up! "At school? Did you take letters, or other things?" "Other things?" He appeared now to be thinking of something far off, and that reached him only through the pressure of his anxiety, yet it did reach him. "Did I steal?" I felt myself redden to the roots of my hair, as well as wonder if it were more strange to put to a gentleman such a question, or to see him take it with allowances that gave the very distance of his fall in the world. "Was it for that you mightn't go back?" The only thing he felt was rather a dreary little surprise.
"Did you know I mightn't go back?"
"I know everything." He gave me at this the longest and strangest look.
"Everything?"
"Everything." "Therefore did you—" But I couldn't say it again. Miles could, very simply.
"No, I didn't steal."
My face must have shown him I believed him utterly, yet my hands, but it was for pure tenderness, shook him as if to ask him why, if it was all for nothing, he had condemned me to months of torment. "What, then, did you do?" He looked in vague pain all around the top of the room, and drew his breath 2 or 3 times over as if with difficulty. He might have been standing at the bottom of the sea and raising his eyes to some faint green twilight. Well, I said things. Only that? They thought it was enough to turn you out for? Never truly had a person turned out shown so little to explain it as this little person. He appeared to weigh my question, but in a manner quite detached and almost helpless. Well, I suppose I oughtn't. But to whom did you say them? He evidently tried to remember, but it dropped. He had lost it. I don't know. He almost smiled at me in the desolation of his surrender, which was indeed practically by this time so complete that I ought to have left it there. But I was infatuated, I was blind with victory, though even then the very effect that was to have brought him so much nearer was already that of added separation. Was it to everyone? I asked. No, it was only to... But he gave a sick little headshake. I don't remember their names. Were they then so many? No, only a few. Those I liked. Those he liked? I seemed to float not into clearness, but into a darker obscure, and within a minute there had come to me out of my very pity the appalling alarm of his being perhaps innocent. It was for the instant confounding and bottomless, for if he were innocent, what then on earth was I? Paralyzed while it lasted by the mere brush of the question, I let him go a little, so that with a deep-drawn sigh he turned away from me again, which as he faced towards the clear window I suffered, feeling that I had nothing now there to keep him from. And did they repeat what you said? I went on after a moment. He was soon at some distance from me, still breathing hard, and again with the air, though now without anger for it, of being confined against his will. Once more, as he had done before, he looked up at the dim day as if of what had hitherto sustained him nothing was left but an unspeakable anxiety. Oh, yes, he nevertheless replied. They must have repeated them. To those they liked, he added. There was somehow less of it than I had expected, but I turned it over. And these things came round to the masters? Oh, yes, he answered very simply. But I didn't know they'd tell. The masters? They didn't. They've never told. That's why I ask you. He turned to me again, his little, beautiful, fevered face. Yes, it was too bad. Too bad? What I suppose I sometimes said, to write home. I can't name the exquisite pathos of the contradiction given to such a speech by such a speaker. I only know that the next instant I heard myself throw off with homely force, "Oh, stuff and nonsense!" But the next after that I must have sounded stern enough. What were these things? My sternness was all for his judge, his executioner. Yet it made him avert himself again, and that movement made me, with a single bound and an irrepressible cry, spring straight upon him, for there again, against the glass, as if to blight his confession and stay his answer, was the hideous author of our woe, the white face of damnation. I felt a sick swim at the drop of my victory and all the return of my battle, so that the wildness of my veritable leap only served as a great betrayal. I saw him, from the midst of my act, meet it with a divination, and on the perception that even now he only guessed, and that the window was still to his own eyes free, I let the impulse flame up to convert the climax of his dismay into the very proof of his liberation. "No more, no more, no more!" I shrieked as I tried to press him against me, to my visitant. "Is she here?" Miles panted as he caught with his sealed eyes the direction of my words. Then as his strange "she" staggered me, and with a gasp I echoed it, "Miss Jessel! Miss Jessel!" he with a sudden fury gave me back. I seized, stupefied, his supposition, some sequel to what we had done to Flora, but this made me only want to show him that it was better still than that. "It's not Miss Jessel, but it's at the window, straight before us. It's there, the coward horror, there for the last time." At this, after a second in which his head made the movement of a baffled dog's on a scent, and then gave a frantic little shake for air and light, he was at me in a white rage, bewildered, glaring vainly over the place, and missing wholly, though it now, to my sense, filled the room like the taste of poison, the wide, overwhelming presence. "It's he!" I was so determined to have all my proof that I flashed into ice to challenge him. "Whom do you mean by he?" "Peter Quint! You devil!" His face gave again round the room its convulsed supplication. "Where?" They are in my ears still, his supreme surrender of the name and his tribute to my devotion. What does he matter now, my own? What will he ever matter? I have you. I launched at the beast, but he has lost you forever. Then, for the demonstration of my work, there, I said to Miles. But he had already jerked straight round, stared, glared again, and seen but the quiet day. With the stroke of the loss I was so proud of, he uttered the cry of a creature hurled over an abyss, and the grasp with which I recovered him might have been that of catching him in his fall. I caught him. Yes, I held him, it may be imagined with what a passion. But at the end of a minute, I began to feel what it truly was that I held. We were alone with the quiet day, and his little heart, dispossessed, had stopped.